Hello again, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Hussein Basma from the ICCT, and I'm really happy to be with you here today to moderate this exciting session on the benefits of EV charging flexibility. So earlier this week, RAP, ICCT, and Evolved Energy Research, we just finalized and published a report that analyzes the value of EV charging flexibility in the state of Colorado in the US. Acknowledging the fact that we do have a growing fleet of EVs globally, their integration into the power grid will be a challenge, especially if that integration is unmanaged. And it can result in significant increase in the needed investment across the entire value chain of the energy system. And this is where smart or managed EV charging can help overcome many of those challenges. This is basically the essence of today's webinar. So to highlight those challenges and demonstrate how managed charging can unlock significant energy system savings. So with me today, we have two amazing speakers. Our first speaker is Camille Kadoch. So Camille supports RAP's work on climate-related issues, utility regulatory policy, energy efficiency, and other related policy topics. Camille has most recently focused on issues related to performance-based regulation, energy efficiency obligations, no regrets planning, and beneficial electrification. And she's also RAP's general counsel. Before joining RAP, Camille worked in private practice litigation. Camille holds an undergrad degree in biology and environmental studies from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, and she graduated with a Juris Doctorate and a Master's in Environmental Law from Vermont Law School. Our second speaker today is Amy Wagner. Amy is a senior partner at Evolved Energy Research. She has worked on strategy and modeling for net zero transitions and new business models for clean energy technology with senior teams across industry and government for more than 20 years. Before joining Evolved Energy, Amy worked as a senior expert for McKinsey & Company, where she was a global leader in renewable and sustainability practices. And I'm really excited to have you both presenting today on this very timely topic. Before we kick this off and before I hand it off to our speakers today, I'd like to go over a few logistical details. Well, first, because we have a big audience, we will keep your microphones muted. However, you will have the opportunity to submit any questions you might have to our speakers by typing those questions into the question box, the Q&A box that you see in the panel. You may send in those questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect them and answer those questions at the end of the session. The webinar is officially scheduled for 60 minutes, but we plan to stay online for an additional half hour to answer more questions if needed. And finally, you should also know that this webinar is being recorded. So in a few days, we will send you a link to that recording. So as for today's agenda, we will first start with the purpose and definition of this study. So Camille will provide us with an explanation of why we have conducted this study in the first place and the context for why we chose to look at Colorado. Then Amy will provide a high-level overview of the methodology, the main assumptions and scenarios we have considered. Then Camille, again, will summarize the study main findings, conclusions, and recommendations. And finally, we will have a bunch of time for questions and interaction from the audience. So with that being said, and without any further delay, I will hand it over to Camille.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for joining us today as we talk about this exciting topic. Next slide, please, Donna. So the exciting thing about EVs, whatever their capability is on the road, from an energy system planner and operator perspective, the exciting point about EV load is that it's flexible. And given the correct signals, consumers, you, me, all of us here, can shift when we charge our EV to times that are still convenient for us and also convenient and usable for the grid. This is really great news when we have an era of increasing load, increasing variability in weather, and really a critical need for flexible resources to accommodate this really dynamic environment that we find ourselves in. Conversely, if you don't incorporate flexible load, such as EVs and other electrified load, consumers might end up paying more for infrastructure investment than is really necessary to meet this load. So we wanted to explore more about this. The fact that EVs are flexible is actually not news. Past studies have illustrated the potential for EVs to provide this flexibility. But what we wanted to do was to quantify the value of that flexibility for a particular jurisdiction so that people can really see what the illustrated value is of these benefits and how it can comply in their jurisdiction as well. We chose Colorado because firstly, we had the available energy sector and transportation data, critically important to be able to do analytical modeling to show this. But it's also a growing state, and it contains a large and growing transportation corridor. It's also acquiring and integrating large amounts of variable renewable energy. So we thought that this fact that it's incorporating a lot of variable renewable energy would be useful for other states as they look at this path as well, integrating variable renewable energy, and it would also help to illustrate the benefits of EVs to accommodate that variable load. So with this context, this background, I'm going to turn it over to Amy Wagner from EER to go through the modeling and the assumptions that underpin this study. Amy.
Thanks, Camille. So we're going to start with a little bit of background on the models themselves. Everyone's favorite moment to get a little nerdy. So Evolved used two integrated models to understand the demand side flexibility provided by transportation sector. So we have two models. The energy pathways model is our demand side model, which you can use to develop different types of scenarios with different in-use technologies that have different levels of adoption or different characteristics. Those demand technologies are then, we then calculate an hourly load associated with those demand technologies, and that hourly load is passed to our supply side model, which is a least cost capacity expansion model, looking at the best pathways to achieve different energy policy goals. In this case, Colorado's goal of achieving 100% clean in the electricity sector by 2050. Given the different levels of demand flexibility, the model solves for the least cost portfolio to reliably serve the electricity sector. So one other feature of RIO is that it requires the model to meet certain reliability constraints, such that you can't, for example, have just renewables to meet energy load. You need also to have flexible, dispatchable resources that all compete for that need in the model, which is important because that is what the transportation side flexibility is doing, is providing the generation with more flexibility in order to get to lower cost overall portfolios. And what we did also here is we used ICCT's state level analysis and projections for vehicle adoptions to develop the demand projections for energy needs for each type of vehicle and the driving pattern and charging needs by vehicle type. And this allowed us to map vehicles to 4 archetypal feeders: a residential feeder, a commercial feeder, a highway, sort of fast, ultra fast feeder, and an industrial feeder. So the allocation of the loads to the feeder types then is another important assumption. So if you look at the light duty vehicle assumptions, you have 61% of the vehicle charging happening at the residential home, 25% happening at public chargers, and 14% happening at highway fast chargers. And I'll let you sort of read across to understand the different distribution by vehicle type for the scenarios. Then we created 4 different scenarios. The first scenario is envisioning an unmanaged charging system without any load shifting benefits. So when the vehicles arrive to charge, they immediately charge. They are not optimized or shifting their load in any way. They just, it's upon arrival. For the low flexibility case, we assume that for residential charging, 50% of the vehicles are able to shift by 4 hours, but there's no public charging shifting for LDVs. There is also no additional flexibility assumed from the medium and heavy duty fleet. For mid flexibility, we assume that 75% are able to shift by 8 hours for light duty vehicles, and 25% are able to shift by 2 hours for the public charging. So you can imagine these as office charging where the vehicles are parked for the full day. High flexibility, there is significantly more flexibility, and 75% are able to shift by up to 24 hours. This isn't to say that the model asks the vehicles to shift at this much on a sort of daily basis, but you can shift to that level. This is also within the range of the actual flexibility of light duty vehicles, based on the 10% utilization of light duty vehicles in normal operation. Then you have the light duty commercial that are able to shift by only up to 4 hours, because you still have some limitations in terms of the resting state at those types of chargers. So in the next, then that puts us into the competition that I alluded to. So as the model builds out different portfolios to meet the clean energy standard, it requires the energy supply and demand to be met on an hourly basis, and that requires different reliability, different levels of reliability or flexibility from other types of resources. So you have charging flexibility, so moving demand across time. You have conventional batteries, which I think everyone sort of thinks of first as the main source of flexibility. You also have hydrogen electrolyzers that can compete for serving that flexibility. Gas-fired generation with carbon capture, given the 100% clean requirement, and transmission. So there's a bunch of different options for serving flexibility within the model, and the model is looking for the least cost portfolio of generation resources to meet the demand, as well as the flexibility resources to ensure the reliability. So this brings us to the main findings of the report, and we're happy to re-summarize or answer questions regarding the model setup or any specifics during Q&A. But if we look at the overall finding, one of the biggest finding, of course, is the actual value to the system. So from looking at flexibility low to flexibility high, we have $100 to $300 million a year in 2035 and $200 to $900 a year by 2050. It's a significant amount of value that is coming from a lower cost overall portfolio. So you have to build a less overall renewables, and you're able to not invest in as many batteries. And in the case of the highest amount of value, the value is partly coming from reduced investment in fossil flexibility. So those natural gas generation with combined with carbon capture and storage. So one part of that is that the flexibility value increases as the amount of variable energy increases. The second point is that the majority of flexibility value comes from LDVs in the residential sector, and we'll explain why that is. The highway sector or fast chargers provides the least amount of flexibility value to the electricity system. And flexibility helps mitigate the cost of reducing emissions as well as reducing the overall cost. And the residential savings that you could get based on the value of the LDVs in the residential sector could buy 1.3 million level 2 chargers with 100% incentive. And finally, the flexibility that you get from these demand side transportation different opportunities helps flatten the net load curve. The net load curve is the load that needs to be served after you net off the renewable energy, the variable energy load. So we will potentially get to that at the end if we have enough time in Q&A. So here we have this additional graphic on how the value changes over time. This one is relatively straightforward, and you can see where we get the overall values that were on the previous page, but then the breakout by archetypal type of charger, or sorry, archetypal feeder type is actually potentially a little bit more interesting, and that is the next page that shows that the majority of the flexibility value comes from light duty vehicles. And here you can see in orange or reddish orange is the residential feeder type. And then on the right side, the blue is a combination of light duty vehicles in commercial charging applications and in residential charging applications, and represents the majority of the benefits in all cases, and in particularly in the flexibility light case and in the flexibility high case. And you can also see that the residential flexibility value comes here. Well, you can't see it here, but where it comes from is that it comes from the avoided T&D value as well as the different generation mix that you get when you're looking at least cost pathways. So the sort of intuition for why residential charging provides more value to the system is because it is at the end of those distribution lines, and because you have the additional flexibility, you don't have to invest in that distribution line, the transmission line, as well as the generation. So it's the full stack of upstream resources. And the second piece of intuition in terms of why LDV vehicles have more value to this system is because LDV vehicles have more sort of resting time at for overnight charging and more hours which they can flexibly move, and lower overall utilization. Thus, they have more inherent flexibility. The highway sector, similarly, like in the sort of reverse logic, provides the least value of the four sectors. This because convenience factor is the highest for highway charging. So from a customer's perspective, you pull into a highway charger and you expect to have your car charged as expediently as possible. There's some amount of highway charging that is overnight charging for heavy duty vehicles and some MDV vehicles. There you have some of the additional flexibility that we talked about in the scenarios, but generally the flexibility overall is lower. Secondly, in contrast to residential, the highway charging interconnects at the transmission voltage, so you do not get those distribution level investment savings. And there's less of an overall need for highway charging flexibility because it competes more directly with large scale demand flexibility, such as hydrogen electrolyzers. Finally, fast charging flexibility is not expected to have high participation for LDV users in particular because of the convenience value. So in terms of mitigating the cost of emissions, here you see the different dollar per ton on a marginal basis by year for each different scenario. So flexibility high obviously has the lowest overall cost of carbon because of those additional savings to the electricity generation portfolio and to the T&D system. And here's number 5. So here we wanted to look at specifically what is the consumer cost saving directly. The consumer cost saving directly, $7 to $30 per megawatt hour, is not overly significant in terms of getting people to directly change their behavior. So what you're trying to do is develop infrastructure that unlocks the inherent flexibility value of the vehicles. And once there's enough, you can also see that the overall value is relatively flat until you're able to unlock enough energy in flexibility high to change the investment in fossil resources in particular, and also change some of the more substantial T&D investments. So with that, we have one more finding that we could cover that I don't have a ton of time here. Oh, we'll just jump to it since we have a little bit more time. So here we can see that flexibility flattens the net load curve. So when you're looking at this chart, you're looking at the dark black line, which is the net load. The bold black line shows that the net load is flatter than the load itself. And that is after the model chooses the least cost portfolio to deliver flexibility and reliability. And so the model is trying to flatten that load curve and using all of the flexibility resources, such as storage and transportation demand flexibility, to flatten the net load curve. I think there might be questions on this later, so I'll leave that for that point, because I want to make sure that we get to our overall conclusions and recommendations before Q&A. So I'll turn it back to Camille.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to Amy and EER for that great research, which really helped us to illustrate the value that that managed EV load can provide to states. And now we get to the so what? What do we do with all this great information? And the challenge is to incorporate this information into the policy so that it applies in the programs and the planning that we're able to incorporate at the state policy level. And so the value here that this illustrates is that it has the potential for Colorado to reduce infrastructure costs by 100 to 300 million per year in 2035, and even greater, 200 to 900 million per year in 2050. Not inconsequential. But I think the point that we also want to make is that these benefits won't materialize on their own, which is why regulatory commissioners, state departments of transportation, and vehicle dealerships, perhaps if that is how incentives are rolled out and programs are rolled out, will all need to coordinate to ensure that consumers have the tools they need to enroll in the programs and the complementary electric rates, which will help to realize these benefits. We also need to ensure that utility planning accounts for and integrates EV customer program plans so that this can be most effectively realized. Next slide, please, Donna. So the study found that managed EV charging can save on infrastructure costs. And there's a variety of ways that states could choose to deal with these savings. One option that we thought to highlight was that you could pay 100% of the cost of a level 2 charger. This would be a huge incentive to get EV customers to enroll in the program. And then it also still has the ability to reduce the costs for non-participating customers as well. That'd be one option for how states could utilize the savings that can be realized from managed EV charging. Next slide, please. It's also really critically important that these benefits and these programs are incorporated into planning. It's important for this to be integrated into the various planning processes that utilities have. For instance, if the impact of managed EV charging programs are not included in distribution plans, the plans will continue to call for investment in a system that could otherwise be avoided. Similarly, if the benefits of managed EV charging are not incorporated into load forecasts, then the planners will continue to produce load forecasts that are too high, leading to more investment in generation than might be strictly necessary. So this leads us to our recommendations. We've learned some valuable things about which EV sectors to focus on first and how to most effectively realize these benefits. So firstly, focus on the LDVs in the residential sector first. Then can focus on medium and heavy duty vehicle sectors after that. Second, as I said, you need to enroll the customers in the programs to realize the benefits. So develop customer programs that enroll them at or near the point of sale. This might involve coordinating with dealerships, making sure that incentives are easily able to be explained, accessed, and understood by customers so that when they buy an EV, they're excited to enroll in the program and help to realize the benefits. This also means that the rates that the customer sees need to be customized for each sector, and that also help to maximize customer retention. So think about it. Light duty vehicle owner will have probably different needs from a charging rate than medium or heavy duty vehicle owners and for what they see for the programs. Those rates need to be customized to each sector so that the customers enroll and stay in the programs. It's also important to develop well-integrated utility operating systems that incorporate the EV load, are able to send the signals effectively, and that this is all incorporated into the utility planning process, which is our final recommendation here as well, so that the EV benefits are accounted for, enrolled, and incorporated into utility planning processes. And I think with that, we've come to the end of this section of the webinar, and I'm going to turn it back to you, Hussein, for questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both, Camille and Amy, for this very insightful presentation. We do have a bunch of questions actually already in the chat, and our colleagues are already responding to some of them. but we also have a bunch of pre-submitted questions from our attendees, from the participants. And let's say one question that was quite common, it's about those savings that we have been quantifying. So the question is, how are those savings quantified? Like, are they quantified relative to an unmanaged charging scenario in Colorado? Amy or Camille, you want to take that?
Sure, I'll take that. So the savings are all relative to our flexibility none case, which is an unmanaged charging case. So each case looks at if you expanded the level of flexibility of the fleet of vehicles by a certain amount, so not very much, quite achievable level in flexibility light, a little bit farther in flexibility mid, and then sort of really invested in the infrastructure necessary to enhance the flexibility of the vehicles in flexibility high. One of the sort of aspects that we noted while we were doing the work is that actually in particular for residential charging, the customer's access to a level 2 charger dramatically changes their ability to flex the charging and shift the charging over the time periods that we had in the different scenarios. So a level 1 charger is much less flexible and creates much and there's more convenience than when you get a level 2 charger. And that's why we did the calculation of net present value of the benefits to the electricity sector to see how that would compare to the infrastructure investment in level 2 charging, which Camille went over, the 1.3 million level 2 chargers that could be paid for with the electricity sector cost benefits.
Thank you, Amy. We do have another question in the chat from Rafael Lomonaco. Rafael is asking, what is the applicability of using the study metrics and methodology to a broader aspect, such as a country analysis, or along the lines of, can we replicate the same methodology in a different geography, more or less?
Yes. So I think certainly you can replicate the same methodology, and Camille or Hussein, if you want to talk about the work that you guys are doing elsewhere, but the modeling methodology is quite replicable. What changes is that each geography has different renewable resources, has different demand profiles, has different electricity sector goals, and broader climate goals. And the model is solving for the least cost pathway with all of those things in mind. So a sort of rule of thumb from this study would not be transferable to another geography. So you can't take like $1 per vehicle from this study and move it to another geography. However, the analytical approach of developing these demand side flexibility scenarios and then running them in a supply side capacity expansion model is quite replicable.
Yeah, definitely. And to add to that, so as Amy mentioned, this is part of a global project where we are demonstrating the benefits of managed EV charging in 4 different geographies. So today we talked about Colorado in the US, but we're also doing something similar in France, in Europe, and in China, and also in India, employing the very same methodology, but as Amy mentioned, different inputs, different market dynamics, and potential different results. We will be summarizing the main findings from all 4 regions in one global report. And yeah, it'll be interesting to compare the findings across different regions. We do have another question. Actually, it is something that Amy touched upon like quite quickly in the presentation. It is about one of the recommendations regarding the how can EV charging flexibility actually flatten the load curve? So could you please elaborate a little bit more about this?
Right, so a load curve without flexibility, I think is the way to imagine it best first. So without demand flexibility or battery flexibility, you would have a variable resources of renewables that would create a very sort of much more dramatic net load curve with higher ramps and to meet the decline of the solar, et cetera. When you have demand flexibility, batteries, other flexibility resources, you're able to smooth and flatten that net load curve and make it easier for the remaining resources to serve that load. So you don't get the same extreme spikes, ramps, and that makes the overall system easier to operate.
Thanks, Amy. Again, so we also have another question about our assumptions regarding the percentage penetration of EVs by 2030, which is basically an integral assumption for this study. So yeah, maybe I can cover this from my side. So actually, the choice of Colorado for this use case is due to its significant vehicle electrification pace and targets, and its ambition to increase the share of renewable generation and its power mix. So back in 2020, Colorado did publish its EV plan, announcing long-term goals of 100% electric light-duty vehicles by the second half of next decade, and with an interim target of 1 million EVs by 2030. So that's basically our main EV penetration scenario aligned with the Colorado State EV plan. Yeah, I hope I answered that question. We do have another question in the chat on battery swapping, actually. Actually, a bunch of attendees are asking about the heavy-duty vehicle battery swapping, if that was considered in our analysis, and what role do we expect this to play when it comes to EV charging flexibility?
Yeah, so we did not directly consider it, but I think that it actually is a way to consider the MDV and HDV flexibility likelihood. So for MDV and HDV, we have percentages of the vehicles that are willing to sort of swap or willing to flex, and those would be much higher percentages or more likely to be the higher percentage if you had battery swapping programs and in different locations. And so I think that that's the way to look at it for now, until you were able to get data on what the overall likely percentage of battery swapping would be. So I would look at it as a way to think about the probability that you could actually achieve the MDV and HDV flexibility.
Yeah, just to complement that as well. So yeah, from the heavy-duty vehicle side, battery swapping is still a technology under investigation. We have seen a couple of promising projects, mainly in China, and we know in India, there's especially in Delhi, there are a bunch of demonstration projects ongoing now, trying to understand how we can utilize battery swapping, especially for heavy trucks, to minimize the dwelling times at depots, and also use that as a flexibility resource to the grid as well. I guess this is one of the top priority topics to further examine in future studies and proposals by RAP, ICT, and other partners. We do have a question maybe to Camille. So a question on the incentives. So what type of incentives do you think are the most effective in motivating residential clients to participate in flexible charging programs?
Yes, incentives. But I think there's a broad way to look at this, and starting simply from making programs easy for a consumer to enroll in, right? So one of the thoughts that we had here was that some of these savings could be utilized to pay for the cost of a level 2 charger. Make it easy for the customer to do the right thing for the grid, for themselves, for their pocketbook. Making it easy is a really critical step in engaging and keeping consumers. Secondly, making it clear to them what kind of savings they can realize by doing the change of behavior. So if there's a significant delta or change between if you charge at a high peak time versus a low peak time, making that apparent to them as well, so they can see the math, do the math, to be able to see that this is the benefit that I can receive from doing these things. Obviously, if you're able to then otherwise incentivize the customer with customer savings, the level 2 charger, and there's a variety of different program types that we've seen out there for EVs, which is going to be the subject of another forthcoming paper that will come out, is to look at different ways that the rate design plus the incentive plus the program can work together to create this, create an environment that the customer wants to enroll in the program, stay in the program, and realize benefits. So I don't think there is a one simple answer, but we do know that making it easy, making it accessible, making it easy to enroll, and making it clear to the customer, those basic elements are critical in any program that you do. And certainly any incentives to sweeten the deal for the customer would be greatly appreciated. It will increase enrollment as well.
Thank you, Camille, for this very thorough answer. Yeah, still more questions popping up. One question from Courtney Lane. Courtney's asking if we have taken into account the costs of the utility programs needed to incentivize the load shift included in the analysis. Yeah. Who wants to take this one? So did we take into account the cost of the utility programs needed to incentivize the load shift that we considered in this analysis?
So utility costs of programs are different across the board, but the overall customer cost is similar to a demand response, the administrative cost for a utility to run a demand response program. It does not include paying the customer directly. It was just looking at the utility admin cost of running the program. And so trying to be policy neutral in terms of the approach that a regulator would want to take or that a utility would want to take. And I'll answer at the same time another question that I was just looking at in chat, which was on the same sort of vein, which is the low customer costs of $7 to $30 per megawatt hour seem low to people, but that's the cost on average for the hours, the shifted energy hours. If you looked at a more dynamic cost, depending on which market you're in or depending on which demand response program design that you were participating in, you could layer in a lot more direct consumer cost into specific hours. Alternatively, you could pay for upfront infrastructure cost, as we showed as just one example of a policy approach or a regulated investment approach, which would just then enable a lower overall cost to the customer. So the customer, as long as the car is charged in the morning, shouldn't care if you've shifted the charging cycle over the evening when the car is dwelling in the garage. And so there's a bunch of different approaches that you could take. So the study only incorporated the basic admin costs of a utility program like this, not like didn't sort of parse it into which portion of that should be direct to the consumer, what portion of that should be infrastructure, incentives, et cetera. as there's a bunch of different ways that you could approach it.
Just one thing to add on to Amy's answer there. It is important to recognize that this analysis is looking at often a broader suite of flexible resources than you may see in other analyses, particularly in existing sort of planning processes. So we didn't go into it in detail here, but federal incentives for hydrogen production from electrolysis actually make electrolyzers a much more attractive, flexible resource. And the more flexible resources that you incorporate into analysis like this, the lower the value of any given resource is going to be, right? So if we repeated this, taking some of the potential candidate resources out here, and it really was just sort of electric vehicles potentially competing against like a fossil peaker plant that was burning a clean fuel, right? We'd see potentially much higher values.
If I could just tag on to underscore Jamil's point there. If you're looking at this in other regions, as Amy said, you can do the same analysis and you're going to get a different answer. So in other regions or other states, the value of EV load could be much higher if there's other competing load to provide that flexibility is fewer, less, more expensive. So the value of EV load could be significantly higher in other places as well. Sorry, managed EV load. Back to you, Hussein.
Yeah. Thank you all for chipping in and answering this question. We do have an interesting question actually from Che Gao. Che is asking, how can we convince policymakers that this flexibility is actually firm and thus could be safely incorporated into load forecasting and distribution planning? Like, are there any similar lessons from other demand response programs that we have seen so far?
I can start and welcome panelists chipping in as well. We do have, as I said, the exciting thing about EV load is it's shiftable. It is a demand response, and it is using EVs as managing EV load is akin to other demand response programs, which is not a new technology. We've got decades of experience with this and familiarity with these programs, how they can show up, and how you can count on it as you look at it. So there are experiences that we're able to draw on from others, from other types of demand response to be able to show this. And there are actually experiences that we've had with managed EV load that can be pointed to from other jurisdictions as well. And so that might be some resources that we'd be able to follow up with at a future date. Amy or Jamil or Hussein, anything to add?
I think you covered it well.
Yeah. Thank you, Camille. We do have another question. So could you elaborate on the consumer savings and why the value to consumers was quite modest? Amy, do you want to take this one?
I think we partly just covered that with the discussion about the competition of transportation demand flexibility with other demand flexibility like electrolyzers, like Jamil was saying, and the fact that the number that's presented is an average across all of the hours of flexibility that are being provided. So it's not really an equivalent metric to a demand response payment, and that there's lots of different policy choices and utility choices in terms of how to allocate the value to the system that we've calculated. So we calculated the overall value to the system, and then there's 2 points where the value to the system could be greater if there's less competition for flexibility and you don't have electrolyzers or some other resources competing for that. And then there's potential design choices that could be different, that would give a higher cost to the consumer for specific hours.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, we actually have a couple of questions about the methods we've employed or the data we have collected regarding the real-world hourly charging load profiles of EVs. Yeah, maybe I can take this one. So yeah, I mean, this could take a while, but I'm going to try to be brief. So yeah, basically we're dealing with an entire fleet of vehicles here, low passenger vehicles, light duty vehicles, heavy duty vehicles, with quite different driving patterns and parking profiles. So maybe just to highlight our main assumptions and data inputs regarding EV charging load, like passenger vehicle charging load, to be more specific. So we basically model the typical driving pattern and parking profile for a typical passenger vehicle in the United States, taken into account is its overnight parking time, its parking time during the day, also taken into account what percentages of single dwelling homes in Colorado might be equipped with chargers, and what percentage of EVs might have access to residential charging at home, or like to apartment charging, or to public charging, or to work charging in some cases. So a bunch of assumptions that go into quantifying this EV charging load, again, depending on the type of vehicle. But for the light duty vehicles, most of the charging, the vast majority of charging happens overnight, basically over a period of 8 to 10 hours between 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. For trucks, it is different. First of all, this is not based on any real-world data because we do not see yet a lot of electric trucks hitting the roads. But basically for trucks, we do identify different driving patterns, different parking profiles. For example, trucks in the United States, especially those doing the long-haul trip, they park at public stations along highways for a couple of hours during the day. Sometimes they do park at public depots. Other smaller trucks park at urban depots. So that taken into account, we end up developing different electric vehicle charging load curve, which feeds into the model that Amy just presented in this presentation. So what else do we have? Let's see. So we have a question from Scott. What was the ability to integrate renewables at greater penetrations considered? And if so, how was that benefit quantified?
Yeah, so the overall structure of the way that we're modeling this actually enables us to answer the benefits associated with integrating renewables over the whole time period. And we are modeling 100% clean for Colorado. So we get to full, that we achieve that policy goal in all of the flexibility scenarios. And so you get more and more value over time of integrating renewable resources, but you also have other competing flexibility resources that are competing to manage that integration challenge. So those things combined are basically what creates the overall value and the dollar per megawatt hour on a yearly basis. Jamil maybe could answer that further, but the actual structure of using a capacity expansion, least cost capacity expansion model is meant to answer that as part of its least cost pathway, is to provide the lowest cost path to integration of renewables.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, again for answering this. So yeah, we are already close to the top of the hour. Maybe to revisit our main recommendation slide and main findings from this study. So yeah, basically, definitely to start focusing on light-duty vehicles in the residential sector, simply because we have concluded that they have the most charging flexibility, and they do represent, I guess, more than 2/3 of the overall potential system savings in Colorado. So that's priority number one, I would say. Next, developing customer programs so that customers are enrolled in those programs. This is the very first step in securing the benefits of this charging flexibility. So enroll customers in managed charging programs and enable their participation through incentives. And then definitely design customized charging rates for each sector. All customers should be offered complimentary electric tariffs that compensate them from offering their charging flexibility to the utility and to the grid as a service. We recommend also developing well-integrated utility operating systems. This is a must in order, to have the ability to monitor and measure and control the EV loads that are enrolled in their programs. And finally, develop well-integrated utility planning processes. Make sure that we take into account the customer programs and they are well integrated into the utility planning process to produce precise load forecasts. So this is just to revisit the main recommendations and takeaways from this presentation. We are happy to stay online for a couple of bonus questions. But those of you who need to drop off now, as I mentioned earlier, we will be sending you in a follow-up email the link to the webinar recording, and we will be posting the slides and the report already online on RAP's and ICT's website. So let's see, a couple of more questions before we close this webinar. What else do we have? I do not see, I think our colleagues already answered a lot of those in the chat. But yeah, in any way, we will be more than happy to answer any follow-up questions after the webinar. But yeah, any final words from you, Camille and Amy?
Thank you for attending. We hope that you read the report, and happy to answer any questions that follow up from it. But I think the main message here is that there's a lot of benefits to be obtained from managed EV load, and a lot of steps that policymakers can take to integrate into their policies and into the programs so that this can actually be realized, accounted for, and provide consumer benefits.
Yep, and then from Evolved's perspective, thanks for attending. The sort of electricity and transportation interconnection makes for a more difficult modeling challenge, but understanding all of those dynamics of competing flexibility, understanding what happens to the overall generation portfolio, what happens to T&D and the cost structure, costs and investments that are needed there. Those are all of the pieces that you need to understand in order to really fully understand this problem. And so I guess I encourage folks to also spend some time looking at overall integrated resource planning. If you've spent more time in the transportation sector, the electricity sector value comes from the integrated resource planning process, where you do modeling, like the modeling we did in coordination with RAP and ICCT. So,
yeah, thank you again, both Camille and Amy. I do hope that our participants will leave today with a better understanding of how EV charging flexibility can actually unlock significant savings for the entire energy system. Yeah, the end vehicle electrification is ramping up across all road transport segments: cars, trucks, buses, motorcycles, two-wheelers. And with this continuously growing fleet, we do not only see challenges, related to grid integration, but we also see opportunities to explore the technology benefits. And I hope we were able to demonstrate that in today's presentation. Thank you, Camille and Amy, once more, and thanks to our engaging participants today. You will be hearing from us again soon. We are, as I mentioned earlier, demonstrating the value of EV charging flexibility in other regions in the EU, India, and in China as well. So thank you again, and I wish you all a lovely rest of the day.